Hi, I'm Jason Bradford.
I'm Rob Dietz.
And I'm Asher Miller. Welcome to Crazy Town, where the sanest guy around is protesting the local gas station in the St. Lucie.
The topic of today's episode is Runaway Money, and please stay tuned for an interview with Nate Hagens.
Did I ever tell you about the time where I had to spend 5 nights sharing a bed with a 6'9" guy?
No, I thought that was Jason's story.
No, Jason's story, if I recall correctly, is he was up on top of a mountain and he was spooning with 2 guys.
Okay,
Yes.
That's right. Okay, so this is similar, but let's hear your
By the way,
story.
that's a callback, to season 1, maybe?
I don't remember when we talked about that.
Yeah, you gotta be careful. We're getting old. We could be repeating ourselves over and over, and we wouldn't even know it.
As long as it makes us laugh, who cares? No, so I was traveling around Europe. I was backpacking with a friend of mine who happens to be 6'9", and we were staying in some hostel in I think southern France or something.
Wow,
And-
southern France must be nice.
Ooh la la, yeah. And our money got stolen.
Oh, no.
Our passports, all our cash got stolen, and we were just like up shit creek. The only thing we had left was a credit card that I had.
Okay.
And I was able to get a little bit of money out of a bank machine with that. And so we had to take a train back up to Paris to try to get our passports reissued. And we had to wait 5 days or something like that until the passport could be renewed.
So you're like scrounging out of the train dumpster trying to get
Yeah, how do you
food or
survive
what?
in Paris without money for 5 days?
We had just a little bit. So
Yeah.
we found a hotel that was the scuzziest fucking place I've ever probably stayed.
Where was it?
Oh, it was just some
Like the Latin Quarter?
weird, neighborhood in Paris. It was this place where they had carpets, disgusting carpets, but there were holes in the floor
Yeah.
of the hotel room, and you didn't know where they were. You
No.
step, and your foot would kind of go, and you didn't fall all the way through because thank God there was this carpet.
Right.
But you were always like ready
Right.
for a surprise, right?
Wow.
And we could only afford this like one room, so Seth and I would have to sleep in this bed together. It was really hot. It was summer, right? This guy's huge. I'm getting
6'9".
elbows in my face. And all we did was we could only afford to buy like baguettes, so we ate bread for like 5 days.
Nice.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So you're talking about difficulty with money and your inability to.
I'm talking about difficulty sleeping with a 6'9" guy.
Right. Well, I'm gonna still interpret it my way because I wanna tell you a story with a little bit of a money problem. Okay, check this out. So I'm a little kid, and we used to every summer go on vacation in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. This was like highlight of the year for me. I loved going there. Adventure, the Outer Banks, that's where you got the Wright brothers and Blackbeard the pirate and the Lost Colony, all this history.
Warm water.
Yeah, warm water. We'd go fishing, catch these awesome flounder and speckled trout and stuff, and go ride the waves, all that. So the whole trip was, like I said, a highlight, except for the drive to get there. So the way we would do this is my dad would go to work on Friday, but he would come home early, so he'd only work half a day, and then we'd load up the car and we'd take off. And we could only get about halfway there because it was like a 10 to 12 hour drive. And my family was not like a van family. We had like a Toyota Corolla, which...
Oh, so you didn't have one of those like
station
station wagons
wagon. No.
with the seats in the back?
No, this was 80s like little sedan. And me and my sister crammed in the back seat. And it was just a kind of a miserable drive. And we'd typically get to the border of South Carolina, North Carolina late at night and sleep at a Holiday Inn. So we're driving, and I could stomach it because I'm excited to go to the beach. But also, both my parents were smokers.
Oh.
So, and it was summer, so they'd be like, keep the windows rolled up while I'm sucking down this cigarette here. And so I'm like just dying in the back seat.
Literally dying. in the back seat.
Yeah.
So we get about, I think, 2 or 3 hours into the trip, and my parents start sort of panicking, and I don't know what they're yapping about, but it turns out they left the checkbook at home.
Their checkbook.
And they're like,
What are we going to do?
What are we? Yeah, they like pull over and they're like, well, we can't pay for this, we can't pay for that, we can't pay. And we turned around and drove all the way back home
No.
to get the checkbook.
No
and then
way.
driving all the way back.
Torture.
You know, of course
Smoking
it's
all
later
the
at
way.
night, so you got to smoke even more to stay awake, right?
Oh my god.
That is good.
Just horrendous. Like, you know, think of how easily that problem could be solved. It didn't bring your checkbook. When was the last time you brought your checkbook anywhere? Do you even have a checkbook?
I bring it to the grocery store all the time just to piss people off behind
Yeah.
me.
Right.
Well-
I only bring the giant-sized ones like you get for winning a golf tournament or something, right?
Well, I got a story I think is going to beat this one. I'm trying hard. I'm going to
Okay.
try. I'm pulling. I'm going to go to even more an exotic Outer Banks. Madagascar, baby.
Oh.
Wow, you guys in your world traveling. I thought I was exotic going up the East Coast there.
So Madagascar, this island off the coast of East Africa. Incredible place. I was there for a month in November of 1997. And I'm in my late 20s at the time. And I'm doing these botanical expeditions. And I'm in the capital, Antananarivo. And I have to go to the big bank downtown to use my traveler's checks.
Wow, traveler's
Yeah.
checks. There's a blast from the past.
Oh yeah.
And I have to pull out enough cash to live for 3 weeks in the wilds of Madagascar, paying my way to get there, buying all kinds of food for an expedition, and then paying porters and people to help me along the way because I'm going to go climb a mountain in the north of Madagascar. Literally, I'm going from about sea level to about 2,000 meter peak and back down again with like people carrying my shit.
Yeah.
And so I decided, I budgeted out, I said, I need $1,500 in cash. The only problem is the largest denomination bill in Madagascar, and each bill in Madagascar is huge. I mean,
it's like a towel.
yeah, it's like, yeah, right. You can, yeah,
It's
if
like
you're-
one of the checks I was talking about that you
Yeah.
get for winning a tournament.
Yeah, and they're beautiful. They're all artsy and, oh my God, colorful and stuff. But they're gigantic bills, and the largest denomination was worth $5. So I get
So
$1,500.
you needed a wheelbarrow.
Right. So I go by myself into this bank and I write these traveler's checks out and I like slide it to the teller and the teller starts counting out these bills and
17 hours later.
I get this giant wad and I've got like a t-shirt on. It's hot. I'm in the tropics. I got like a t-shirt on and I'm like, oh God, what do I do? So I just stuff it and into my pants. And so I look like I have a panis, like this huge like folds of like my guts are just gigantic and distended.
Can we put a word of gratitude out to the porter who not only carried your stuff but had to accept bills from out of the front of your
Oh,
pants? You know, like, I hope you dried them out before paying.
I hadn't thought of that. Anyway, everything went well, but it was a little nerve-wracking to walk around with that much cash, knowing that like the average Malagasy at the time earned about $2 a day, right? If they were a wage earner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody should have bumped you off.
Yeah. I was pretty conspicuous walking out of that bank.
Right. Well,
Waddling out of that bank.
Waddling out of that
the
bank.
good thing is that people don't really have to go through these let's just call them the sufferings of the privileged that three of us experience.
Yes, I think that's what I want to talk about today. That our hidden driver for today is money, but not money per se, but the fact that the barriers to the use of money have just been getting lowered and lowered. It's getting easier and easier to get money and to spend money.
Yeah, it's like the spending money used to be running the 110-meter hurdles, but now it's like the hurdle's just been cleared away and you just run a 100-meter dash, no problem.
Yeah.
Or you drive a 100-meter dash.
Right. It's a lot easier. So, and this, of course, though, is accelerating consumption of goods and services in our economy.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the sort of the removal of these barriers, making easier and easier. But money itself was actually an invention to help remove barriers.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, before that, it was always, barter, right? It was a direct exchange of goods.
I mean, I think we were living in tribal communities and it's like, whatever, okay? People are just living in their extended families. But yes, as soon as you get to a situation where you got to trade with another group,
Right.
you have to barter.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could get things from far away, but it had to go through all of these exchanges of goods in order to get to you, right?
Yeah.
And so the creation of money allowed people to not actually have to exchange those things. Especially imagine exchanging things that are, if you're trying to exchange something that was really valuable, it might be large, heavy,
Right.
cumbersome, whatever.
Right.
You know what I mean? So money was itself was a removal of a barrier, right?
Right. But then, as money got invented, it went through all these stages. And we don't want to sit here and go through the minutia, the history of money. I actually, in prep for this, read a really nice book by Jacob Goldstein called Money, The True Story of a Made-Up Thing. And I would recommend that if you want to do the history of money. I think we'll put a podcast episode in here too that reviews, in the show notes, that reviews the history. But there were some things along the way that were dropping these barriers that I think we want to hit. And one of the ones I wanted to bring up is the movement from coins or other things that are made of metal or shells or whatever to actual paper money. And Goldstein actually has a really nice anecdote in his book. He talks about how Marco Polo, after he went on his adventuring, he wrote his memoir. And in that, he had this story where he's like, okay, guys, you're not going to believe this shit because this is some crazy shit, but prepare yourself. This really happened. Over in China, they were using paper for money.
Right.
Can you believe this?
That would be mind-blowing, actually.
Right. The concept. So they in Europe, they've been exchanging gold coins, precious metals, right? Heavy and stuff, but they're precious and they have an intrinsic value and they're shiny. Yeah. And they're like, no, we just use paper.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the way this came about is in China, they were using precious metal as well, sometimes not so precious metal like iron. And if you wanted to go buy something that was valuable, you basically had to carry an Olympic weight set of iron with you in order to pay for this.
That's how people stay fit.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody, is all that strong. So what ended up happening is you could store your iron or whatever, your precious metal in a bank, what essentially became a bank, but with somebody who would then write you a receipt on paper who said, hey, you have this much money. And then, it wasn't very far along from that people started trading those paper receipts and saying, here, you can have this, and now let me have some food or, an actual good that I want to consume.
Yeah, so paper money, but it's backed by these deposits of these metals or whatever, these precious things in a vault somewhere. And that has stuck with us for a long time. And this exchange within your own country is interesting. So the fact that you're within China, they recognize this paper. But
let's go back to what was happening there. I mean, it was basically under threat of death and violence. This story in Goldstein's book, he talks about when Kublai Khan had invaded and was ruling China and saw that this paper exchange, this use of paper money was working well, and he's like, everyone here will accept this paper money or we're just going to bury you alive.
Right.
So it's like it was imposed.
Yeah. Okay, got it. But it works within that society. But then if you wanted to trade outside that society, they still used gold. And so I was looking up the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Really? You were in 1803 looking this up?
Oh, sorry. No, I was a couple days ago on the internet, and I was saying to myself, how much was the Louisiana Purchase and how did they pay for that? And it turns out the U.S. bought the Louisiana Purchase, a lot of not just Louisiana, but a lot of Western territories from France in 1803 because Napoleon was like, I need more money for wars. And gold was what he needed. And the U.S. said,
fine. He needed a better battle plan as well, I think. But that's another story.
He did all right for himself for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, and he got to retire on an island. Anyhow, it was $11.5 million worth of gold the U.S. had to transfer to France. Now, the logistics of that, there some complications. So what actually turned out is the U.S. didn't actually put gold that they had in North America on a ship. That was considered too risky. But they had sovereign gold reserves in Europe. John Adams figured out how to do this. And so they transferred it from the banks that the U.S. already had money in Europe into the banks that Napoleon wanted them to put it
So
in.
instead of having put it on a ship, they put it on a carriage or something like that.
But it was 36,000 pounds of gold is what they needed.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I was kind of blown away by the $11.5 million.
Yeah, it's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, you think of like Jeff Bezos, how much land could he buy at those kind of prices?
It was a few bucks an acre or something at the time.
Right.
Yeah. But I think since that time, there's really been, though, an acceleration of making it easier and easier to create money and to spend money. And one of the big ones was getting off this gold standard, sort of deciding money doesn't have to be represented by these precious metals. Why? We don't have to do this. And this started happening in the early 20th century during the Great Depression. Now, there were these theories from economists that said, we don't have to be tied to gold, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really then the Great Depression and Roosevelt that said, fine, we're not on the gold standard anymore. And that allowed the government to sort of create money without having to have more gold reserves. You think about it, to expand the money supply prior to this, more gold had to be mined, or silver. Silver was a precious
or
commodity.
stolen.
Or stolen, yeah, exactly. Or found in the bottom of ships' holes that had sunk in the Caribbean.
Wait, so just so I'm getting the history right, I don't think Roosevelt took us off the gold standard. It was just that the government basically bought up all the gold.
It was a kind of a start. It was a process that was finished in Nixon era, but it ended up sort of breaking that complete tie to gold and confiscated the gold that people were basically making runs on banks and trying to get out gold.
Well, and people were agitating. I mean, before the Great Depression even hit, people were agitating for this because I think farmers in particular were getting hit really hard with the gold standard. I think that those these are major campaign platform positions for candidates. And I wonder how much of it also had to do with basically ratcheting up consumption, basically.
Sure.
Allowing people to purchase more things to be created,
Totally. It's an invention because if the barrier is like for the money supply to increase, we need to have more gold in our vaults. It's a little bit absurd if you're this industrializing economy, which has this huge capacity for production, but suddenly it's like, why do we have to go out and mine a bunch of stuff to allow us to do these exchanges and expand our economy?
And gold is finite.
Yeah.
I mean,
right. There's only so much gold.
It's really a psychological game, right? Like you think about the idea of coming off the gold standard is scary because now if you are sitting on a big pile of cash, used to be you could go trade it in for gold, which of course has value.
Yes.
That's weird too because gold has value because we
decided
attached
it has
a psychological value to that.
Right.
I mean, maybe it has some more value because it's an interesting metal and whatever.
Well, there's things
its
you could
properties.
do with gold. I mean,
but it feels like it was a big leap psychologically, but in reality, it's the same leap that had already been made. So maybe it's not that big a deal.
Well, it created a currency that could no longer be traded in. So you no longer could trade in your dollar for gold. That broke that, and it said, no, now it's these central banks, it's the government. Money then was backed by essentially the society in general and the faith that you had a well-managed central bank and financial system.
Now, you could exchange that currency for another currency if you're like, this government's, I'm concerned it's gonna fail. It's not gonna be able to hold up to its promises. You could buy currency in maybe another government.
Yes, so that's why governments can't just just create all the money they want because then they get hammered in the exchange market for currency trading.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about money creation. I think there's another really important barrier that was removed around how money is created. Most people think of money creation as happening in, some federal printing press office somewhere. And, some money does get created that way. Coins get minted, bills get printed. But most money comes into the economy when banks loan it into existence. And the way this used to work is if I'm a commercial bank, I'm accepting deposits from the public. They're bringing them in. And I'm allowed now to loan out a fraction of that. That's called the fractional reserve rate. Tells me how much money I'm allowed to loan out based on how much I've got sitting in the reserves.
But it's actually a multiple, so it's like,
Right, it's the other way.
You can loan out like 10 times what you've got on deposit or something.
Right. And it used to be, a relatively small reserve rate. And over time, that's been getting chipped away at. Now, banks, there is no fractional reserve rate. If a bank wants to make a loan, it just makes a loan. And how does it do that? It just says, oh, I just put money in your account. Where did that money come from?
Right. So
nowhere.
The banks basically are looking at, like the local banks are looking at what the central bank is doing to set the interest rate, the base interest rate. And then it's also looking at, if someone walks in, are they creditworthy? Do I think that they're going to be able to pay it back? And they make that judgment call. So...
Yeah.
And what kind of collateral they may have.
And this may be obvious for some people, but it may not be. And that is that when banks create that money, these are debt-based. This is debt-based currency, right? So they're loaning it into existence. And that debt needs to be serviced, right? There's an interest on it. So you have to return the principal, what you borrow, plus the interest on top of that, which we can get into. But it reminds me of a couple other barriers have been removed. One of them actually has to do with computer technology. I mean, very little of the money that's in circulation right now is actual paper money, let alone, coins or whatever.
Except in Jason's case, where his panis is filled with bills.
I still find a bill now and then. I mean,
You might want to wash your clothes sometime.
He's paying at restaurants with that money.
He hasn't changed clothes since 1997. So being able to actually have storing ones and zeros on computers, basically, and loaning money into existence electronically.
Yeah, a lot easier than writing it in a ledger and having to file that.
I mean, so forget the checkbook. Now forget anything. I mean, you don't need anything. It's just all stored on a computer somewhere. Another one I think that's interesting, maybe not thought about very much, is, and this also happened because we've seen with financial crises, banks being unable to pay out, right? There's a run on the bank. People are asking for their money because there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy or the financial system, and banks can't do that, right? Because they were loaning out more than they had. Then the government has stepped in, and now we've got federal insurance, right? So, you're insured up to, $250,000 of money that you have in the bank. And so the government's, in a sense, saying, go for it, banks. Loan this stuff out.
Right. It reduces the risk for a bank to kind of extend more credit than it probably should.
I remember seeing the scene in Mary Poppins where there's the run on the bank. It's like the little kid, he doesn't want to give his tuppence up, and his dad's like, come on, give the tuppence. And he's like, no, I don't want to. And then everybody's like, they're not giving him his money. And a big run on the bank. And I didn't have one clue what was going on in that scene when I saw it.
Did they start dancing?
Probably, and singing, and then they jumped into a sidewalk and floated to the ceiling.
But I think that was written by an author who grew up during the Depression or something. That's what the deal was. So
the other thing about the government, is just to point out, is regulation of money. Well, first of all, I mean, we've given the right to print money to banks, to central banks. It's not actually government doing it. That's one thing. But the other is our regulations, are the policies that we have, the laws that we have on the books, and it was, again, I think in a reaction to the Great Depression, we said that banks that wanted to invest money and commercial banks that were loaning money out had to be separate. And then we did away with that.
So you're talking like the difference between, say, a Goldman Sachs as an investment bank that's doing deals for buying and selling companies and stuff like that versus a commercial bank that's taking deposits from the public
and making loans,
and making small loans.
And so that that was Glass-Steagall was this landmark legislation we had to kind of separate these things, and then we just decided, fuck that, and we got rid of it.
And like 10 years later.
Exactly.
Boom.
Yeah, that was 1999, I think that was. And
was that the name of the bill? Fuck that.
No, they probably called it something like protecting consumers. Economic bliss bill. Right? Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's nice for us to say, hey, life is easier now because we don't have to carry traveler's checks around. Or if our parents leave our checkbook, it's who cares? They've got credit cards and their ATM will work in any bank, right? And that's a nice convenience for us. But I also would acknowledge that for some people, this has been revolutionary. There's parts of the world, outside the major cities, outside highly developed countries with big banking systems, where they really didn't have access to banking services until quite recently. Where if you're in a rural village somewhere, and Kenya is a good example, they developed a system called the M-Pesa, which allows people from their cell phones to basically do banking, to deposit money, to send money, to accept payments. And imagine how that changes somebody's life. And you don't need to be a big player. It's all like this microcredit system.
Well, like any of the things that the three of us tend to dive into, it's always a mixed story. So, the removal of barriers has definitely some positive things going on for a lot of people and some negative things. I mean, like, you were talking about the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act and how that maybe ended up freeing up a lot of money to be invested into places where maybe it shouldn't have been. And,
like fracking.
Yeah, so you get like the fracking boom out of something like
and
that.
The housing crisis.
And then, Jason, you're talking about people living in a rural setting being able to maybe access some really important services they need. So there's always nuance, and I know as Cher, you often talk about the messy middle that we sort of inhabit and try to wrestle with. And I think that's one of the things that we keep revisiting. If you're thinking in systems, if you are exploring how the world works, you come back to realizing, wow, there's a lot of complex systems at play, and there are benefits in some cases and costs in others.
I am going to be glass half empty for a second, though, about this, because this is just a theory I'm speculating. The motivation to remove barriers and to enact the removal of those barriers, I think often comes from people who have money and want to make more money, right?
Yeah.
So it's wonderful when you open up opportunities for exchange to happen, for people to borrow money, like a small business to borrow money, or imagine somebody who's doing something that is very much geared towards addressing sustainability crises that we talk about. Being able to borrow money in order to do that is a positive. But there is something that happens when these rules change, these barriers are removed, that seems to benefit those who already have.
Yeah, those bills in Congress that pass, they're usually authored by guys who are funded by those corporations, by those banks. I mean, not to get overly cynical, but you can buy some pretty good legislation these days.
Well, and you see, going back to fracking, for example, you could see like the role of these investment banks who would help tout these fracking companies, their value to try to get investors to come in. They make money off of those.
The transactions.
Yeah, when they're putting out a corporate bond or something like that to raise money to go drill in North Dakota or whatever, the banks that are facilitating that are making money off of all those transactions. Yeah. And then when those companies go bust because they're completely over-leveraged, they're totally in the red on cash flow, then they get acquired by the large oil companies, right? And then the banks are making money off of that transaction as well,
right.
And so there's a gaming of the system I just want to point out.
And they're creating all these services, and anytime you create services, you could charge for them. And so, I think in some ways, some of these services you could say, for like a lot of consumer level, been quite nice, and maybe our cost is lowered. But again, also what they've done is they've packaged all this big money that is being flung around the world and maybe doing a lot of damage as well. So yeah, I think these barrier removals is really a mixed bag. But I can't say there's a mixed bag with cryptocurrency though. I think it's all shitty. And so I want to talk about that because that's a barrier that's been removed recently where it's like the libertarians, which, I'm not totally anti-libertarian in any means. I understand, civil liberties and individual rights, fine. But they're so anti-government that they want a money system that is not tied to government and not tied to banks, which I kind of get. But what they did was they created this monster where these computer networks are just churning out these cryptocurrency tokens with an enormous amount of energy use.
But this whole topic of cryptocurrency drives me kind of nuts. I don't want to sound like the old man who just doesn't understand anything, but like this blockchainy, and that's related to Dick Cheney probably. But like the blockchain, the NFTs, the way Bitcoin algorithms work. I just don't get it.
It's a classic example of maybe good intentions, interesting idea, maybe some of the motivation for some people comes from the fact that they maybe want to democratize in a sense.
Yeah.
They don't want to have to go through these intermediaries or,
right.
Counting on these banks or governments.
Right.
But then be careful and it's a Wild West right now, I think that we're also seeing, and people are trying to figure out how to.
We're quite a few years in though, right? I mean, Bitcoin came out.
It's still a while. I mean, how many cryptocurrencies are out there? Do you know what I mean?
There's hundreds, but there's like a handful of really big ones that dominate. And
sure.
And if you were to look at the energy use of those, it adds up to tens to hundreds of terawatt hours per year of electricity consumption. And no one knows for sure because how efficient are the computers on each of these networks? It's hard to tell.
We talk about energy pretty often on this podcast, but terawatts, like what are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking of like the energy consumption of fairly significant nation states. So on the lower bound, we're talking, maybe like a Kuwait.
Okay, so let me back this out a little. So you're saying to create a cryptocurrency, the computers that are running in the background to make that happen.
Yeah.
We're consuming as much electricity as
I think you got to back it up even further, which is for people who are not familiar with cryptocurrencies, like they need to have some kind of value. So what they're doing is that they're actually what's called mining, right? And I guess they're doing these really complex equations or something.
Well, it's
like
not.
that.
They're actually doing random number generation. So there's an algorithm, which is a secret algorithm, which generates a random number, and the computers have to guess. And if they match it by chance, they win, and they get to add to the blockchain, and they get a token. It's crazy. It's just like literally random number generation.
Somebody just came up with this random way of being able to create this money.
And they have to make it hard because by making it hard, by doing a lot of work, there's value. But of course, it's not adding any value to the world.
And
it's
that
just
value comes from computers churning this
Yes.
stuff, which consumes electricity.
It reminds me of like playing Super Mario Brothers, where Mario is running and he jumps and smashes the bricks, and then a coin goes into his.
That'd be a lot easier.
Like, why don't we do that? Can we make it a video game instead of a math problem?
But there's 200 nation states on the planet, and right now these cryptocurrencies are in the top 50. Maybe the top 30 in terms of like if you were ranked cryptocurrency energy use.
And they're growing exponentially.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like, you extrapolate very far. And it's like, it's the size of India or the United States in terms of energy consumption. It just gets absurd so fast.
It's awesome. Pretty soon we'll all be like shivering in the dark, but there'll be a lot of Bitcoin lying around out there.
But let's be clear. It's not even energy consumption. That's just electricity consumption.
Yeah.
We're not counting into that the sort of full life cycle of this because all the servers, the computers that need to be
hardware, and the disposal of the waste. Now there's cryptocurrency farms. It's like, well, we bought these 8 years ago, and now too slow. Buy a new set, and they just e-waste. So they're destabilizing electric grids, and they're destabilizing, of course, the computer manufacturing industry is now having trouble keeping up with other demands.
And it gets. Not to make this more complicated, but like, so on one level, you could look at this as like, this is a craze. Like, why is this growing so fast? Why is this happening? Do you know what I mean? Why are people motivated to get cryptocurrency instead of whatever? And I think a lot of it is this is a speculative market, right?
Yeah.
These are growing in value. There's a limited amount of them, right? When things look either uncertain economically,
They don't trust government.
Yeah, they don't trust government. They're worried about the solvency of whatever, or we have a situation that gets really complicated with monetary policy, but if interest rates are really low, it doesn't make any sense to save money, right? Because if you put money, I mean, we grew up saying, put your money in a savings account. Grandma's, birthday money that
penny
she
saved is a penny earned
exactly.
a share.
Will slowly grow over time. Like, no, now you're actually fucking losing money because the interest rate on a savings account is like negative 12%. It's not really, but it's less than inflation.
So
people are trying to make money out there.
You realize if you were putting together the book of pithy sayings on money, it used to be a penny saved is a penny earned, but in a shares book it would say, no, you're fucking losing money.
Yeah.
Well, it's true.
Yeah. Well,
and I know from experience, by the way.
But that's what's happening right now is that the people that have money are like scrambling to find something to do with it. And the problem is there don't seem to be any productive outlets. It's just this fucking around with shit.
So this, to me, this gets to. I mean, we're talking about this a little bit. And, what's the problem with all of this? The removal of these barriers. Like, what's really the consequence here? You talked a little bit, Jason, about sort of the energy consumption of cryptocurrency, for example, right? But what are the other issues?
Well, that's a really good example of what's happening when you talk about, okay, the barriers are being removed, and that means there's more and more and more money available. And that money can grow exponentially without bounds, right? Because
it's not tethered, it's tied to anything.
It's not tied to anything real, and we've essentially said we're all behind this. We agree that it has value. It doesn't, even cryptocurrency is that way. I mean, a Bitcoin has value because we believe it has value. So you can have money growing exponentially. And a lot of times you think, oh, well, that's wealth. Like, Jason, when you walked out of that Madagascar bank and you had a wad of cash, you're like, look at, people, he's wealthy. He's got that panis of doom. But the reality, that's not wealth. That's a claim on wealth. You can use that to actually get real things, real goods, real services in the real world.
Oh, yeah.
And if people didn't accept that claim, it stopped being something that people agreed upon. It'd only be what would be good for. You could burn it like people did in Germany.
Right. You could
the
keep
20s. You could wipe your ass with it. Like what else? What else can you do?
You could keep his waistband warm, I guess, or what. But
well, I've seen this in action. Like I was aware of a deal like several years ago where the central bank of Japan created $15 billion. $15 billion. It's out of thin air. The central bank of Japan created, and then they said,
"It's just an inconceivable number."
Right?
I mean,
and they're like
$15 billion.
And then they gave it to some bank to go invest, and they show up in the U.S. and they just start looking around at things like, what is real estate? Let's buy U.S. real estate. So they were interested in farmland. So I'm just going, holy crap! Some bankers in Japan decide to create $15 billion, and then some millions or whatever just start sloshing around to buy farmland in the United States. And we just accept that as like, yep, that's the way the world works.
Yeah, of course. It's 15 billion yen or dollars or whatever.
Right.
I want a piece of that.
Well, yeah, so that's it. It's like you can create this stuff infinitely. It's just like computer spreadsheets or whatever, databases. Like, I just created it, okay? But it has a claim on the real world. There's only so much farmland in the world, but you can create as much money as you want. And it can now start chasing those real world assets. And that's scary. So the people that have the ability to create money then have an amazing power because it gets accepted.
I mean, I think we have to unpack that a little bit. I mean, so you create money, and people think. So when we talk about, for example, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, being the richest person in the world, the wealthiest person, I always think, well, what's the real wealth there? Because a lot of that is it's not even paper money, right?
It's stocks.
It's made up value. It's an assessed value, right? That could never be actually. If they try to sell it all right away, probably the price would go down. Who knows? Whatever. It's not true wealth. Now they use a portion of their wealth, of that financial wealth for real wealth. Big ass fucking houses in Hollywood,
Yachts.
Buying land. Bill Gates is now the largest individual landowner in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, you're able to actually get true wealth. Land was always considered the real form of wealth out there, but that's just a fraction, really, for them of that claimed wealth that they have. But what happens a lot, actually, and I think that's true probably on a ratio basis more for people who are not as wealthy, is that money is actually a claim on it's used for consumption.
Yeah, right away.
It is actually it does translate into real world impact.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
with the barriers removed and more money circulating in the economy, you have more consumption. That's, if you have more to spend, you tend to spend it, and then that does have real world consequences. That gets back to what you were talking about, Jason. Like, money is there, and then it's chasing real resources. It gets back to what we were talking about with the fracking boom. You have investors saying, where can we buy something that's going to give us something in return? Oh, let's build some fracking wells.
So structurally, there's a couple things that are very interesting then. We have this ability to create infinite amount of money that makes real claims on a finite amount of goods and services in the actual world. And then, though, also is that when the money's created, all they create is the principal. So money is debt. Money goes into existence as a loan. Okay, so cash goes into your bank account so you can buy a house. And now you have to pay the bank back. Okay, so there are two sides of the ledger. But when the bank created that money so you could buy a house, they only created the principal. They didn't create the interest. But what this means in totality over the society as a whole is that in order for you to be able to pay that interest back going forward, the money supply has to increase because there needs to be more money in existence in the future. So there's enough circulating that you can obtain enough to pay back both the principal and the interest. And that's mathematically embedded dependency, structural dependency on growth is in our money system right now.
Right. It gets back to growth, which we've talked a lot about. And growth itself gets back to depleting natural resources and increasing pollution, right?
Yeah.
Well,
it does have a real world impact.
We may have those real world impacts going on, but as long as you have Jason's endless panis, we can pay for those, no problem.
What's interesting for me right now in thinking about this...
You don't stop at the panis. I'm just really upset.
I'm sorry. All right, let's all take a moment.
Okay.
Think about this moment that we're in right now with, I don't even know how many millions of people around the world suffering economically.
Yeah.
You know, in desperate financial situation, building off a lot of, I would say, we talked a little bit about the inequality issue. I mean, what percentage of equities, stock, financial assets do you think the top 10% of Americans own?
Okay, so you're saying the 10% wealthiest Americans.
Yeah, what percentage of
all the stock ownership are they?
Yeah.
4,000%.
You're good at math.
I am always the best at these.
It's going to be most of it.
Yeah, it's a lot. Let's just go.
Yeah, it's something like 88%, right?
Yeah.
And the top 1% are over 50%, right? So
where's Robin Hood right now?
Yeah.
Jesus.
So we've had like this growing inequality in the United States and in other places. And that inequality has been driven a lot by policies that we've had and, reducing tax rates for wealthy people and all these things. And now we're in a situation where people are really desperate because of the pandemic and the knock-on effects to the economy. And we've got governments sort of stepping in to try to bolster the economy and to help people.
Yeah, just putting money right into your bank account. Boom, fast.
And on the one hand, I would absolutely say this is critical.
Right.
There are, just here in the United States, there are tens of millions of families who are desperate,
Yeah, we're going to lift people out of poverty.
So stimulus checks, make a big difference. Raising the rate of unemployment or extending it makes a huge difference. And there are people who've been arguing, again, for removal barriers.
Right.
One of the barriers that we've had is this idea of the debt load, right? So governments just can't spend as much as they want, can't go crazy, although governments have been doing that. And if you look at our total debt, it's been increasing astronomically. But there's always a risk, if your debt level gets so high, will people stop wanting to lend you money.
Yeah,
You know?
or your currency gets hammered in the exchange market, so then you can't trade really effectively overseas, right?
Right. So that's been one of these sort of barriers that people have looked to. But now we've got, modern monetary theory, which says, the concern always also was around inflation,
Right.
And so there's this school of thought that says we don't need to be worried about inflation. We've been in a deflationary period for a long time. We don't have to worry about that. We need to just create more money.
Yeah.
Government, should step in and spend a lot of money, spend money on infrastructure, spend money on climate change, spend money on all the things that we need to. And on the one hand, I would say, hell yes. On the other hand, we have to remember that you put money out there, it goes to real things. Right?
Yeah, every dollar spent. There was a paper I read where they calculated like the carbon dioxide emissions per dollar spent. Like you can really, it's correlated like 98%. You could look at the amount of money that gets spent in a nation and its CO2 emissions. It's incredible.
I think as we move the economy into the virtual world with NFTs, that we can take care of that. We don't have to worry about it. It's just going to be an information economy. You and your real world troubles. It's
virtual. We'll spend virtual crypto money in our virtual crypto world.
Eating virtual food.
Yeah, and drinking virtual hot toddies, and curling up to the virtual fire, and then our fingers will freeze off when the cold front comes through and the pipes burst.
You don't need fingers to spend virtual money in the virtual world. It's fine.
Stay tuned for our George Costanza Memorial Do the Opposite segment, where we discuss things we can do to get the hell out of Crazy Town.
You don't have to just listen to the three of us blather on anymore.
We've actually invited someone intelligent on the program to provide inspiration. Hey guys, here's a 5-star review on iTunes that we got recently. I'm assuming that's graded on a 10-point scale or something like that, maybe a 30-point. This is from 9Blue1. Great names from our reviewers. 9Blue1 says, "This is just a fantastic, well-produced podcast that allows you to laugh off the darkest, most difficult subjects imaginable. It turns out that at least 3 of the horsemen are also stand-up comics. Just subscribe, put this in your weekly mix. You'll end up smarter, better prepared, and surprisingly, more sane. You'll see." So I like that we're the horsemen.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassingly nice.
I know. I'm blushing. God.
Yeah.
My immediate thought was they must be listening to a different podcast.
Well, except that as a horseman, you spread death. That's embedded in this really nice positive review.
That doesn't make me feel better.
Okay. I have cowboy boots.
What does that have to do with anything?
Horse riding.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, hey, if you like the podcast, you should leave us a review as well. You need to be at least as gushing as that review was, or else don't bother.
Yes.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
So if society is knocking down barrier after barrier, doing the opposite in your own life could mean actually putting some of those barriers back up. It sounds a little...
Just lock yourself in your house, right?
Well, it's maybe a little uninspiring, but...
Alexa, don't order the toilet paper for me automatically when I run out.
Seriously, I mean, you don't have to put your credit card into every web browser that you find. You don't have to make auto payments so easy. It really does help if you have some thinking going on each time you pay for something. Every time there's a little barrier there, it actually makes you a bit more circumspect, a bit more thoughtful about what it is you're purchasing and do I really need this thing? So
interesting. Carrying around cash actually might make you hesitate. I think there's actually a psychology there.
Yeah, it really is. Like you're having to give up something to get something. So
right.
I think having some little rules in your life about not making it so easy. And when you do that, you might even have a benefit of protecting yourself a little bit more from identity theft problems too.
Yeah. I think there's a lot going on here with currency, a lot of ideas. And I think there's a couple goals we would want to have. If our problem is we have this globalized economy that always has to grow, and the solution is a more localized economy that actually has to live within an environmental footprint that's bioregional, boy, there's a lot to unpack there about what the money system would be like to support that.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it is just like if you can trade favors with your friends and your neighbors and barter a little bit, that's probably a good thing. But there are some like tools available. So there's a mutual credit system that's very interesting. It was created in Italy. It's now being applied in Wales, where businesses can exchange with the kind of credit holder. And so again, it gets over barter because you can provide services and get credit, and then you can receive services from a different company and cash that in a sense, but you can't exchange it for money. So pretty interesting. It helps focus local economies, helps build local connections that way. David Fleming passed away, but an interesting thinker. He had tradable energy quotas, which is very tied to emissions. And let's get back a little bit to our episode on rationing from last season, where if we need to actually descend in terms of our energy consumption, use less energy each year, then this is a way to allocate that fairly. So if you're thrifty, yeah, you can sell your energy quota. But if you're an energy hog, you have to go buy it. Mm-hmm. And so this is a way of actually reducing the amount of consumption.
Those Bitcoin miners are gonna have to get some serious energy quotas.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we're saying is, in a sense, we don't have to go back to the gold standard, but having currency of exchange that was based upon energy, would be
totally interesting. Because that's one of the big things we do. We just like an energy Godzilla just trouncing through the world.
And that would blow people's minds. Just even the idea of saying, let's have currency that's based on energy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's such a foreign concept.
It makes such good sense, though, because as we've noted, nothing happens without energy. So
yeah, I'm just thinking for us to get to the point where that was actually adopted would be a transformational moment in our collective understanding of how the world functions. And the importance of energy.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's also an interesting idea that was recently popularized by Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. I read that book. And
sci-fi, right?
Sci-fi.
This is not like a how to change the banking system book, right?
Well, in that book, it kind of is. It's part of a lot of things he throws out there of these ideas. And it's all about international banking and the big central banks. And they mint, so to speak. This is all digital, of course, but they mint a carbon coin. And the idea is sort of tied to modern monetary theory that, you can create money for whatever you want. But in this situation, the carbon coin is only minted and given to people who are demonstrating that they're sequestering carbon or offsetting emissions of some kind. Mm-hmm. So that's another interesting way of like, if the tradable emissions quote is about rationing the energy we use, this is about essentially sequestering or pulling carbon out of the atmosphere for projects like reforestation, et cetera.
Last thought for me would be, in terms of thinking about doing the opposite, we talked about MMT and the need to actually support people, the desire to put more money into circulation to support people to meet essential needs, which there are many, many people who need them. A lot of that is based on the fact that we've spent decades and decades and decades effectively taking away contributions from the wealthiest. There's been this growing inequality, and they've been paying less and less into the coffers of government and basically the collective need. And so if there's a concern about putting more money into circulation, creating more money and debt in order to help people meet their needs, and that leads to more consumption, we still need that consumption of basic needs for people. But maybe we could pay for that by going back to taxing the wealthy the way they...
Hey, well, if all else fails, we're just going to go back to bartering. Okay, guys, I got 2 private jets. What do you got to offer me?
I've got a yacht and 7 Hummers.
All right.
All I have is Rob's dog.
You can't barter my dog.
I'm happy to interview Nate Hagens. Nate
is an old friend of mine from the days on the oil drum. He also was a board member of Post Carbon Institute. Today, he is very busy as the co-founder and director of Institute for the Study of Energy and Our Future. He used to be in high finance with Lehman Brothers and Salomon Brothers. Then he shifted his focus to understanding the interrelationships between energy and the environment, finance, and the implication of this synthesis has for human futures. He has a master's degree in finance from the University of Chicago and a doctorate in natural resources from the University of Vermont.
Okay, well, I am really happy to have you here on the show, Nate. Been on the show before, so welcome back.
Great to be here, JB.
Well, you are now in part of this Do the Opposite segment that we're doing in season 3. The idea being that if what we've been doing up to now hasn't worked, should we do the opposite instead? And what does that look like? So what I want to do, though, to set up our conversation is to get you up to speed on what Rob, Asher, and I have been talking about in this episode. The episode's about money, and what we have gone over are some of the properties of modern currency. And a lot of it related to the idea that we've been using different tools to overcome logistical barriers to using money to exchange goods and services. And that nowadays money is getting, easier and easier to create and easier to use. And the downside of this then is that the monetary system now is just sort of part of the overall growth system of the economy. And actually this growth of the economy and the monetary system is actually required for its stability, because debt creation, which creates money, also comes with future interest obligations. So we explain all that. And we also explain that while money is created in the virtual world of bank ledgers in an instant with keystrokes, and so it can theoretically grow infinitely, it makes demands on the real world, and this real world is finite. And so there are a lot of ideas out there, for example, in like progressive political circles, about using modern monetary theory to inject money where governments believe it's needed, maybe even bypassing normal banking channels to do some of this. But that doesn't by itself overcome the sort of problem that by boosting demand for real goods and services, we boost consumption in the real world. And it could also cause inflation. So what we then talked about is that the money system isn't solving some of our main long-term problems, which we consider ecological overshoot. And it is maintaining sort of this, stoking growth, business as usual. And so how do we do something different, do the opposite to reduce the ecological footprint of humanity, our material demands on the earth, and maybe use the money system to help sort of reverse course? So anyway, that's kind of a long preamble to get you up to speed. Any initial thoughts on that, Nate?
Yes, many initial thoughts. Do the opposite. I loved that Costanza Seinfeld episode.
Yeah.
I think it's a real pithy soundbite for our situation, because we are evolved organisms in a social species that found a bolus of fossil sunlight. And from ecology perspective, we're maximizing power. And the issuing of money allows us more access to power than if we didn't issue money. So this is all consistent with our biological heritage. And it's really hard to biologically do the opposite. In my class at the University of Minnesota, at the beginning of the human behavior section, I asked the students to think for 15 seconds and share something with the rest of the class that would reduce their standing, reduce their status with the rest of the class. And they all have this horrible look on their face. And I don't actually make them do it, but to do things against our wiring is really difficult. And to do the opposite right now, to do the right thing for the environment, is almost the opposite thing that would be good for human populations, at least in the near term. Mm-hmm. So we've kicked the can for so long that 50 years ago, we could have done things that made sense and they would have hurt a little bit. Now, the further that we get disconnected financially from the real world, the harder it becomes for anyone to even voice these crazy ideas, because it's a big old rip the Band-Aid off, but it's like a full body cast that we have to take off.
Yeah.
So, so that's my initial thought.
Yeah, I think a good example of what you just said was, for example, modern monetary theory, I think, is sort of this conundrum, right, of wanting to help out, but also maybe causing problems.
I have a lot of problems with modern monetary theory. There's a lot of reality to it, but there's a lot of huge glaring flaws. First of all, I think like many economic theories, it uses a money in, energy and materials out lens, where you and I and our work has looked at energy and materials in, energy and materials out.
Yeah.
So we can print money, but we can't print energy. We can only extract what exists faster. So my first point would be that MMT ignores the fact that private banks create over 90% of the money supply. This means that government ultimately has very little control over the amount of money spent into existence, other than by managing interest rates. So if the government wants control, it should turn banking and finance into public utilities, like public banks at the municipal, state, and national levels. They don't need MMT. That's my first critique. Secondly, as long as there are surplus resources, meaning there's unemployed people and excess industrial capacity, the government can spend as much as it wants. This they get right. But it ignores the fact that ecologically we're running a major deficit.
Right.
And so most forms of government expenditure are making that deficit worse. So there is a way around that, potentially, and that's to fund projects like regenerative agriculture, ecological restoration, that would help reduce the deficit. And in that sense, MMT theorists are right.
Mm-hmm. So we could maybe figure out if, so MMT kind of is in some ways is saying we can expand the money supply, and then it's trying to tie this to these, these things that we say we need to do to deal with the climate crisis, let's say. So you're saying it could work in that regard, but is it just that you're worried about spillover into just creating more money that doesn't get used very efficiently, or it expands the money supply so much that it spills over into other types of consumption, not just sort of planting trees and restoring wetlands and et cetera?
Well, that's what's happening now. First of all, let's not forget that right now, as we're recording this, the U.S. government, via stimulus and central bank support, is paying for 36% of our national income.
Wow.
So 36% of our entire wages and salaries are covered in this nation by the U.S. government. That is absolutely unsustainable. But the problem is, first of all, and we worked on this last year, is when people were offered to get $600 a week in stimulus, they're not willing to go back to work to make $700 or $800 a week at some crappy job. They'd rather just sit at home making $600 a week doing nothing. So we have labor shortages on the lower income end, number one. Number two, a lot of this extra stimulus is going into cryptocurrencies and Tesla options and all kinds of carbon intensive things. And I don't think they can really control that. So yes, the ultimate problem, Jason, is you and I and the people that we know can say we should do this and we should have the stimulus go to civilian land corps or training young farmers. And those are good ideas. They're sound ideas. But the other problem with this stimulus is not only is it physically causing the problems that we just discussed, but it's psychologically making people oblivious to the real risks. Like if we hadn't done all this stimulus and we were borderline in another Great Depression after COVID, then giving 25 grand a year to 20-year-olds to go do ecological and community restoration around the country, a lot more people would have said, yeah, that's a good idea. But right now, with the sugar high that we're experiencing, no one's thinking about that.
Oh, interesting.
So, I mean, ultimately where I was going with that is we can talk about these great ideas politically. They just aren't happening. The political situation is just so fractured and polarized that to get these ecological restoration ideas is really a tall order, but I still think we need to populate them, describe them, research them, and have a break glass in case of emergency plan for when they might become politically viable. So an idea would be, the reason that governments have power is because we have to pay them taxes, and we pay them taxes in a currency. So it's possible that they could have a currency or a part of a currency that you earn from doing carbon sequestration or something positive ecologically in your community. And the only way you can get these dollars, these ecological dollars, is if you do some work that benefits the environment. And then whoever has those dollars, that's how you pay your taxes. So you could have, that could be at a state level or a national level where there's a project that needs to be done. And the only way that you can pay your taxes is if you contribute to that project. Things like that, I think, can happen in the future. And that's a way to avoid using stimulus to buy Tesla options or whatever else.
That reminds me a bit of the carbon coin idea that became popularized by that Ministry for the Future book, Kim Stanley Robinson. So that seemed to get a lot of play. And what you're describing is similar. It sounds similar to what he describes in that book.
It's similar, but the problem I had with the idea in that book is the same problem I had with the people that did the carbon bubble. Is they only look at the fossil fuels and they don't look at the indirect carbon, that all the carbon in the stuff we buy at Walmart and on Amazon, there's carbon in all of that. So it's not just coal, oil, and natural gas. It's the entire freaking system.
I think that book did talk about needing to pair this with carbon taxes or some kind of resource tax. So maybe that's where we turn to, right? If you're going to then inject money basically into the system that's directed towards work you want, restoring wetlands, planting forests, training people to become local organic farmers, et cetera, insulating homes.
Training people to be Jason Bradford.
Oh, that is so sweet. But I'm getting older, so I want young people to do this so I can relax. But anyhow, so what I say on the other side is how do you take money out of the system in a way that encourages labor and discourages, though, the consumption of these resources?
Well, okay. So big picture, here's the problem. We've found this massive supply of fossil magic that has powered our goods and services, our riches, our population for the last 2 centuries. We've used a half to 2/3 of it. What's remaining is both precious in what it's able to do for us, but also environmentally toxic, especially at these scales.
Yeah.
So in order to avoid facing the harsh reality of what I just described, we're creating money at an accelerating pace to avoid facing the bill that's been building for 50 years. So with that backdrop, I can't say what might work the next 2 or 3 years, but in the next 2 or 3 decades, we have to make non-renewables more costly. And if we make them more costly, that will do 2 things. Number 1, it will spur conservation. And number 2, it will spur innovation because those inputs will get much more expensive. So they'll want to make longer lasting products and they'll want to use more non-renewable inputs into the process. So right now, we did some research. 95% of the tax burden is directly or indirectly on labor. Only 5% is on natural resources.
Wow, that's incredible.
So we're working on a project and we're teamed up with Imperial College of London to do the research. The website's called untax.org, but the idea is to put in a tax not only on carbon, but on all non-renewable inputs like fossil water aquifers, sand, copper, anything that's depleting. And, sand right now is in a global shortage. We're taking sand out of riverbeds because of its need
fracking,
solar and silicone and fracking and everything. So if we tax natural resources and then simultaneously remove the tax on human labor, what we're doing is making labor much more attractive. and spurring conservation and innovation at the same time. And this is the way it used to be a couple hundred years ago, but we've moved far away from that.
I think that's incredible because things happen nowadays that just drive you crazy, where I've been in places where they're cheap labor economies where, like, if your lawnmower breaks, you push your lawnmower to a shop, then there's somebody there who can fix it, or nowadays it's impossible. You can't even get a part because they think you're just going to scrap it and buy a new one.
Well, I think this would help. This would help with planned obsolescence as well.
Right. Get rid of that.
I mean, basically we've had, and this is the opposite theme again. Energy has been so unbelievably cheap, thousands of times cheaper than human labor, that we've essentially had mulligans on just about every aspect of our life. Your lawnmower breaks down, you either just buy a new one or you bring it in, get it repaired. People don't think of, I need to spend a meaningful portion of my money on a lawnmower. Maybe it's better that I share my neighbor's lawnmower, or maybe I should buy a machine that lasts me for 20 years. I mean, that thinking is kind of been thrown out with this era of unbelievably cheap energy. And as energy gets more expensive, which it will naturally because of depletion, with the exception of the fact there may be a financial reset at some point due to the number of claims that we've created. But as energy gets more expensive, a lot of the really energy intensive processes in the world will become less profitable or even unprofitable.
Right. Like
airlines or aluminum smelting, concrete creation, things like that. So what we're doing, I mean, if we could wave a magic wand and solve, quote unquote, solve this problem, what we would do is say in the year 2030, gasoline is going to be $10 a gallon. Everyone get to work and prepare for that reality. The reality is we couldn't do that because no one would believe that, because of what's happened in politics, no one would believe that would ever happen. So we wouldn't do anything. And then December of 2029, someone would come out and say, no, we were kidding. But if energy was a lot more expensive, we would make better decisions that were aligned with our real future.
Yeah. And someday, if you understand, oil depletion and all this, it will get, even if it's not monetarily more expensive, but it will become harder to afford in general. So for the average person,
I think it's harder to afford now. It's just the stimulus is obfuscating that fact.
One of the things that's, that I think it makes it hard to sell this is that if you're selling, hey, tighten the belt a little bit, work a little harder, you're asking a population to do this who also sees such wealth inequality. And I'm wondering how important it is to figure out how to get a sense of social cohesion, a sense of shared sacrifice and fairness back. You just talked about a tax, the untax, which is taxing non-renewable resources, but not taxing labor. Would that help in this, or there's other things we need to do to deal with the wealth gap?
As far as untaxed, we're doing research on that. It's unclear how that would, because labor would become so much more attractive that people would want to hire people again. So I'm not sure how regressive a tax like that would be. But first of all, yes, we are approaching a Marie Antoinette moment for society because so many people have been left out. And that's kind of a little bit of a biological power law that 80% of the resources just eventually funnel to 20% of the population until it breaks. I think personally, this is getting a little off topic, we will have a lot more equality in the coming decade because the rich are going to lose 90% and the poor are going to lose 30%.
Oh, interesting.
When the financial hit comes. But the rich will still be rich and the poor will even be poorer, just not, the relative divergence will narrow. But, Wes Jackson. There's a guy that works with Wes called Stan Cox.
Yes.
He's kind of the world expert on the concept of rationing.
We might have covered that in season 2, actually. So yes.
Well, he has a new book out called Any Way You Slice It. And it points out that direct rationing would be far more equitable than price rationing. In other words, the market signals go up, and that is indirectly rationing, because energy demand is highly inelastic. The total value of like carbon rationing coupons would increase as the supply decreased. And if everyone was assigned an equal ration, because of that power law distribution of energy use I mentioned, most people would see their incomes rise and inequality fall as we reduce the ration, which is why if people were more biophysically literate, such a scheme would be way easier politically to do to reduce carbon emissions. So I don't know. I mean, this is such a complex story that we're talking about. But the biggest problem I see is we're not going to be able to do anything really radical until there's a crisis. I mean, even last year, I thought that was the moment to do a crisis, and I was involved in that. And the discussions we had, if I would have brought up, excuse me, Mr. Congressman, Mrs. Senator, we need to do the opposite, I would have been hung up on. So it's actually the opposite is when you have no other choice. But to be honest, or to be blunt, this untax idea is pretty freaking radical, and I think it would work.
Yeah, I like it because it solves these problems. Like, I think a lot of people realize we're over-consuming resources and we need to encourage work. And this basically handles that, but it ends up being overall your tax burden might stay the same or go down. It's just that we're reallocating where the taxes come from, right?
Right. And also it gets rid of this Mulligan Monty Hall sort of structure. And if you have a job and you make $50,000 a year, you now get to keep all 50,000 of that.
Right.
And with that, you might decide to save some, or you might decide not to buy the iPhone that's now 3 or 4 times expensive. You might share and collaborate with other things. It would lead to decisions that are more aligned with reality.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's great. Well, Nate, thank you so much for coming on, because this is a complex topic and I know how much you've thought about it. So we really appreciate your insight. And there's a website you have. Is it untaxed.org? Is that right? That people can learn more about that?
That's one of them, yeah.
Any others you want to throw out there?
Energyandourfuture.org.
Energyandourfuture.org. Okay.
You should start a dotheopposite.org where you would list kind of the 10 problems that we face. And then one day a month, like the 29th of the month, try to have ecologically pro-future people do the opposite in their own lives. Have a list of things that wouldn't naturally come to them, but if they did that, it would be better for the future and better for the environment.
That would be a good sort of maybe conclusion of this season. We kind of pull all that together and package it. Good idea. I'll bring that to Robin to share.
Okay.
All right. Hey, have a great week, Nate. Thanks so much, and good talking to you.
Thanks, JB. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Crazy Town.
Yeah, if by some miracle you actually got something out of it, please take a minute and give us a positive rating or leave a review at your preferred podcast app.
And thanks to all our listeners, supporters, and volunteers. And special thanks to our producer, Melody Travers.
We've got a great new sponsor here in Crazy Town. The Beatles tell you Can't Buy Me Love, 80s movies with Patrick Dempsey tell you the same thing, but turns out you can.
I know, it's all bullshit nowadays. I mean, what I don't think people understand is how innovative humans are and how we solve any problem that comes in front of us, okay? And there's been a new breakthrough, and it turns out money can buy you love.
That's right. With crypto love, they're mining a new currency, can buy me love.
The only problem is it only works in VR.
Well, Jason, you've bought 3 virtual wives with your crypto love.
Yeah. It's good. I mean, I'm spending a little too much time with them, honestly. It's kind of affecting my real world relationships, but it's interesting.
Don't worry, pretty soon you won't have one.
Right. It's a better life.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.